You were told that the 2026 Iran conflict started on February 28th, when B-2 bombers dropped bunker busters on Tehran. That is the visible war. The real war started 8 years earlier, in 2018, when the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and turned on a financial weapon older than any missile, sanctions. The stated goal was to collapse Iranian oil exports. The phrase Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent used at the Economic Club of New York was blunt, making Iran broke again. Sanctions did not weaken Iran. They gutted it. Oil did not fund the collapse. Dollars did. The denial of dollars. By denying Tehran access to hard currency, the U.S. aimed to cause high rates of inflation and destroy the value of Iran's currency, the rial. Bessent bragged that these measures caused Iran to run out of dollars, meaning Iran could not pay for imports or stabilize its currency, leading to significant inflation. The rial did not decline. It disintegrated. On 19th March 2025, the exchange rate passed 1 million rials to a single U.S. dollar, making the rial the least valuable currency in the world. By 14th January 2026, the rial had plummeted from approximately 42,000 to over 1.1 million against the dollar, rendering purchasing power almost non-existent for imported goods. By the time the bombs fell, the rial had dropped to 1,750,000 to $1. Think about that. A currency losing over 97% of its value in under a decade. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of domestic policy alone, because one country decided to sever another country's access to the global financial system. Bessent described the sequence on Fox News. In December, their economy collapsed. We saw a major bank go under. The central bank has started to print money. There is a dollar shortage. They are not able to get imports. And this is why the people took to the street. He called it economic statecraft. No shots fired. No shots fired. But the damage was done before a single jet took off. This is Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. What you're about to watch is a pattern. It played out in Iraq from 1990 to 2003. It played out in Libya in 2011. And it played out in Iran from 2018 to 2026. A sanctions regime designed to break an economy. A broken economy that triggers mass suffering. Mass suffering that produces internal unrest. Internal unrest that provides the political cover for military intervention. 3 countries, 3 decades, 1 blueprint. And the cost lands on you. U.S. drivers will see gasoline prices start to rise immediately, with analysts projecting an average 10 to 30 cent per gallon increase at the pump within a week. JPMorgan Chase has warned that Brent crude oil prices could spike to 120 per barrel if this conflict leads to a sustained disruption of oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. That means higher food prices, higher shipping costs, and higher inflation for every household in the Western world. The economic warfare waged against Tehran does not stay in Tehran. It bleeds into your grocery bill, your gas tank, and your retirement account. This is not ancient history. This is your financial future, playing out in real time. To understand Iran 2026, you need to understand Iraq 1990, because the playbook is the same, the language is the same, the sequence is the same, only the names change. The UN Security Council imposed comprehensive economic sanctions against Iraq on August 6, 1990, 4 days after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Resolution 66-1 placed a blanket ban on all imports and exports except for medical supplies, and, in limited humanitarian cases, food. The stated goal was to force Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, and later, to dismantle weapons programs. The sanctions did not end when the Gulf War ended in 1991. The Council kept them in place as leverage to press for Iraqi disarmament and other goals, despite a harsh impact on innocent Iraqi civilians, and an evident lack of pressure on Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. They lasted 13 years. 13 years of economic strangulation. Iraq relied on imports for 70% of its food supply. Within a year of the sanctions being imposed, Iraq's exports plummeted by 97%, and imports declined by 90%. An economy built on oil revenues had those revenues severed overnight. Oil exports had earned Iraq between $12 and $15 billion in 1989, accounting for some 95% of its total foreign exchange earnings. When the oil money stopped, everything stopped. The scale of economic sanctions against Iraq was described as probably unprecedented in recent history. The impact on earnings and livelihoods was disastrous. Real earnings fell by around 90% in the first year of the sanctions, and then fell by around 40% more between 1991 and 1996. There was a steady shift of people into casual labor. Sanctions contributed to a significant reduction in Iraq's per capita national income, high rates of malnutrition, shortages of medical supplies, diseases from lack of clean water, lengthy power outages, and the near collapse of the education system. During the 1990s and 2000s, surveys and studies found child mortality more than doubled during the sanctions. with estimates ranging from 227,000 to 500,000 excess deaths among children under the age of 5. Read those numbers again. Between 227,000 and 500,000 children dead, not from bombs, from the denial of food, medicine, and clean water. The machinery of extraction was precise. The delivery of humanitarian goods was equally compromised, mainly because of the efforts of the United States and Britain within the 661 Committee. After the mid-1990s, the only countries on the committee that blocked or delayed humanitarian goods were the United States and Britain, and of those, the United States was responsible for 90 to 95% of the holds. In practice, the holds involved an opaque and arbitrary process, in which billions of dollars of urgent goods related to food production, water treatment, road repair, electricity, transportation, and telecommunications were prevented from arriving in Iraq. The system was engineered to maintain pressure on civilians, while the regime at the top consolidated control. Saddam Hussein did not weaken under sanctions. He tightened his grip. The people who starved were not the gatekeepers of the regime. They were the population beneath it. Civilian suffering in Iraq was not an unexpected collateral effect, but a predictable result of the sanctions policy. And after 13 years of this economic siege, the United States invaded in March 2003. The US and UK governments always made it clear that they would block any lifting or serious reforming of sanctions as long as Hussein remained in power. After more than 12 years of sanctions, the US and the UK made war on Iraq again. The sanctions did not prevent war, they paved the road to it. The economic sanctions imposed on Iraq by the United Nations Security Council from 1990 to 2003 have been called the worst humanitarian catastrophe ever imposed in the name of global governance. Libya was the speed run. In Iraq, the Sanctions-to-War pipeline took 13 years. In Libya, it took weeks. The military intervention in Libya, led by NATO and its allies in March 2011, followed United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973. The UN Security Council approved a measure that included sanctions against the Gaddafi regime, a travel ban, an arms embargo, and a freeze of the Gaddafi family's assets. The United States announced it had frozen at least $30 billion in Libyan assets. Sanctions were the opening move. Military force followed within weeks. The international understanding of all necessary measures at the time of the resolution did not include regime change. Yet in April 2011, Obama, Cameron, and Sarkozy released a joint statement that it was impossible to protect Libyan civilians without this action. Gaddafi was killed, the regime fell, and then the international community left. French airstrikes targeted the dictator's last remaining military assets before Gaddafi was executed. Following the execution, there was an immediate mass exodus of international actors from Libya. The aftermath was marked by armed conflict, chaos, fragmentation, civil strife, and instability. More than a decade later, the intervention continues to be debated for not having been driven primarily by humanitarian concerns, but rather by national and geopolitical interests of the intervening powers. After the collapse of the dictator's regime, few strong governmental institutions and individuals with experience in governance remained. Threats to the new state's legitimacy were rarely met with effective public policy. Among these threats were the 60-plus independent militia groups vying for power with access to weapons, equivalent to 3 times the Libyan population. Although the Gaddafi regime was overthrown months later, the asset freeze remains in place almost 15 years on. Libya's transition descended into chaos, with rival governments intermittently at war from 2014 until today. Libya went from a country with one of the highest per capita incomes in the region to a failed state with 2 rival governments, open slave markets, and no functioning central authority. At the time of the unrest in early 2011, Libya had one of the highest per capita incomes in the region, a 95% literacy rate, and a booming oil economy compared to its neighboring countries. The Sanctions-to-War pipeline operated on a compressed timeline, but the structural outcome was identical to Iraq: economic pressure, regime removal, and post-intervention collapse without a plan. Now apply the pattern to Iran. In 2018, the Trump administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Maximum pressure began. At the time the 2015 accord was implemented, the rial traded at about 32,000 to the dollar. From that moment, the financial noose tightened year after year. Iran's economy has been battered for years by international sanctions, particularly after Donald Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from Tehran's nuclear deal with world powers in 2018. The infrastructure of the maximum pressure campaign targeted every bottleneck in Iran's economy: oil exports, banking access, hard currency reserves, foreign investment. Bessent vowed to close off Iran's access to the international financial system by targeting regional parties that facilitate the transfer of its revenues. In 2018, when the first Trump administration tightened sanctions, oil revenues reached $51 billion. In 2020, they sank to $5 billion, 90% collapse in the revenue that funded the entire government budget. Since the Iranian Revolution, Iran has been heavily dependent on oil revenues to supply the government's annual budget. In 2009, 60% of the government's budget came from its oil and gas sector. Cut the oil revenue and you cut the state and you cut the imports. Cut the imports and you cut the food supply and you get hunger. Hunger produces protests. Protests produce a pretext. Inflation skyrocketed to over 48.6% in October 2025 and 42.2% in December 2025. As of March 2025, estimates ranged from 22% to 50% of Iranians living under the poverty line. Food prices led the surge. Within a single month, prices for dairy and eggs rose by more than 19%, meat and poultry by nearly 20%, and oils and fats by upwards of 50%. Food inflation was 13.8% higher than the previous month and a staggering 89.9% higher than the previous year. The Ministry of Social Welfare announced in 2024 that 57% of Iranians experienced some level of malnourishment. Meat became a luxury food item, with 7 million Iranians going hungry. The protest came precisely on schedule. The protest began on December 28th in commercial hubs in Tehran, when shopkeepers, merchants, and small business owners staged strikes and demonstrations to protest soaring inflation, the collapsing rial, and deteriorating economic conditions. A slow-burning economic crisis reached a tipping point in late December, after a slump in the national currency to a record low made even basic goods unaffordable. Shopkeepers and merchants were the first to take to the streets. By early January, the unrest had grown into a nationwide revolt involving students, workers, and other groups calling for an end to the theocratic regime. In Iran, access to a stable, state-set currency exchange rate was reserved for a privileged few, and economic networks linked to the Revolutionary Guard sat closest to the front of the queue. The IRGC did not suffer under sanctions. They profited. Currency instability became structural rather than accidental. Access to dollars or import licenses depended less on market forces and more on political alignment. This is the same dynamic that played out in Iraq. Sanctions concentrated power among the elite while destroying the population underneath them. The gatekeepers got richer. The people got hungrier. The regime violently repressed the protests, leading to a death toll estimated at between 3,117 per the Iranian government to upwards of 36,500, making them some of the largest massacres in modern Iranian history. And then, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel initiated coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, which included the reported killing of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. Sanctions, currency collapse, mass suffering, protests, crackdown, military intervention, Iraq, Libya, Iran. The pipeline delivers. The war against Iran does not stay in Iran. It flows through a 21-mile-wide channel of water between Iran and Oman, and it arrives at your front door as a price tag. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. The strait handles the world's largest crude oil tankers and is one of the world's most critical oil choke points. In 2024, oil flow through the strait averaged 20 million barrels per day, equivalent to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks on Israeli territory and U.S. military bases in Gulf states, while the IRGC issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. Tanker traffic dropped by approximately 70%, with over 150 ships anchoring outside the strait to avoid risks. The conflict has pushed the Strait of Hormuz to a de facto closure through insurance withdrawal, putting at risk roughly 20% of global oil supply alongside critical volumes of jet fuel, LPG, and LNG serving Asian and European markets. An IRGC commander said the strait was closed and that any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. At least 5 tankers have been damaged, 2 personnel killed, and about 150 ships stranded around the strait. The flow of oil is the flow of global commerce, and the pressure points in that flow have been weaponized. An estimated 84% of the crude oil and 83% of the LNG that moved through the Strait of Hormuz went to Asian markets in 2024. China, India, Japan, and South Korea were the top destinations, accounting for a combined 69% of all crude oil flows through the strait. Oil prices surged on Monday, with Brent crude up 8.7% to $79.28 per barrel, while WTI gained 7.8% to $72.16. JP Morgan analyst Natasha Kaneva noted that regime changes in oil-producing countries can have a profound impact on oil policy, production, and global oil prices. These events typically lead to a substantial spike in oil prices, averaging a 76% increase from onset to peak. Since 1979, there have been 8 such instances. JP Morgan predicts that if the strait is completely blocked, Middle Eastern oil producers can maintain normal production for a maximum of 25 days. Once the blockage exceeds that window, crude storage will reach saturation, forcing producers to cut output or halt production entirely. JP Morgan estimates that Gulf producers dependent on Hormuz have about 343 million barrels of onshore storage, enough to sustain around 22 days of output if exports are stranded. If disruptions exceed 3 weeks, Brent enters the $100 to $120 range. One analyst warned this scenario could present a scenario 3 times the severity of the Arab oil embargo and Iranian revolution in the 1970s and drive oil prices into the triple digits. The math is straightforward. 20% of the world's oil flows through a choke point controlled by a country the United States is bombing. The disruption does not require a formal blockade. The U.S. will not be able to control one-off attacks on tankers, and that is enough to make the market extremely cautious about sending vessels in. And that's what creates the disruptions. 30% of Europe's supply of jet fuel originates from or transits via the strait, while 1/5 of the global supply of LNG passes through the waterway. Your heating bill, your airline ticket, your food costs, all of it runs through the Strait of Hormuz. The Sanctions-to-War pipeline does not end at regime change. It ends in your wallet. You know the pattern now. Sanctions, economic collapse, civilian suffering, protests, crackdown, military intervention. So the final question is the one history answers for us. What happens after the intervention? Iraq tells you. After the invasion, Washington called for and obtained the lifting of sanctions, a step that gave the U.S. occupation authority full control over Iraq's oil sales and oil industry. Iraq, which had the second largest oil reserves in the world, went from sanctions to occupation to sectarian civil war to the rise of ISIS. The institutions that sanctions had hollowed out for 13 years did not rebuild when the regime fell. They stayed hollow. Libya tells you. Libya's transition descended into chaos, with rival governments intermittently at war from 2014 until today. Over 60 independent militia groups vied for power with access to a total quantity of weapons equivalent to 3 times the Libyan population. A country that once had among the highest living standards in Africa became a synonym for state failure. And now Iran. JP Morgan's lead commodities strategist told clients, the main risk remains institutional breakdown and a potential civil war, amid pronounced domestic polarization and heightened ethnic tensions. A senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations stated that eliminating Khamenei is not synonymous with regime change, that the Revolutionary Guard is the system itself, and the likelihood of achieving regime change through airstrikes alone is extremely low. The IRGC controls an estimated 50% of Iran's economy. Sanctions did not weaken them. Sanctions enriched them by eliminating international competition. Any post-intervention scenario faces a country of 90 million people with a devastated currency, a military-economic complex entrenched at every level, ethnic fault lines across Kurdish, Baloch, Arab, and Azerbaijani populations, and a destroyed civilian infrastructure. As trust in the rial as a store of value erodes, economic actors will increasingly rely on foreign currencies, further hollowing out the national currency's role. Without fundamental change, the trajectory points toward dollarization. Iran's economy is buckling under severe currency collapse. The rial has fallen to record lows, losing half of its value against the dollar in 2025 alone. Food, medicine, rent, everything essential has become harder to afford. The historical record is clear. When you destroy a country's economic infrastructure through years of sanctions, then remove the political structure through military force, you do not create democracy. You create a vacuum. And vacuums get filled by the most organized, most armed, and most ruthless actors available. In Iraq, that was sectarian militias and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS. In Libya, that was a constellation of armed groups that shattered the state into fragments that remained broken 15 years later. In Iran, the organized actors waiting are the IRGC and its network of economic and military leverage, built and strengthened over 8 years of sanctions pressure. The very entity the United States aimed to neutralize is the one best positioned to fill the void. This is the structural flaw at the center of the Sanctions-to-War pipeline. The weapon designed to weaken the target ends up strengthening the most dangerous elements within it. The civilians pay the cost, the gatekeepers consolidate, and the military intervention that follows inherits a country far more fractured and far more dangerous than the one sanctions were supposed to reform. The unconscionable human damage done by the Iraq sanctions is routinely dismissed as the unintended consequence of a well-intentioned policy. But, in fact, the Iraq sanctions program is the template for the systemic, devastating sanctions we see in place today, albeit in a subtler and more circuitous form. The template did not change. Iraq, Libya, Iran, 3 points on a single line. And that line runs straight through the global economy, through energy markets, and through your household budget. The next time someone tells you a war started when the first bomb fell, Remember what you learned here. The first bomb was financial. The first casualty was a currency. And the first battlefield was a spreadsheet at the U.S. Treasury. The war against Iran did not begin on February 28, 2026. It began the day someone decided that the rial had to die. Everything after that was the pipeline delivering its product. Watch the money, follow the sanctions, trace the collapse. The pattern is there for anyone willing to look. And the pattern says the aftermath will be worse than the war. That is what history reveals. That is what comes next.